Welcome back again, students. Today we are going to discuss Gramsci, and more specifically, we are going to look at the context of Gramsci's writings. So we have had several lectures on Tagore, and we will continue to have some more lectures on Tagore. We will probably need 2, maybe 3 more to complete our discussions on Tagore. But in the meantime, we are also going to start Gramsci because Gramsci is equally complicated, if not more, and we need to give him, like, Gramsci's writing demands significant amount of attention. So we'll start Gramsci parallelly. All right. So that said, we are starting with Gramsci today, and very specifically, we are going to look at the historical context and a little bit also of the political context in which Gramsci was writing and the writings that we are going to read. So you must already be aware of the fact that Gramsci was incarcerated. In other words, he was in prison for quite some time, more than a decade, and the writings that have been published in Gramsci's name are known as the prison notebooks. Now, I'm not sure Gramsci chose that name, prison notebooks, I don't know, but they have come down to us as the prison notebooks, and it's a lengthy volume, it's a huge volume, but from there you have only a very tiny portion, which is the formation of the intellectuals. It's a very significant part of Gramscian thought, and this idea of who are the intellectuals and how do you define an intellectual, or the classification of intellectuals that Gramsci shows us, is very useful, not only in our study of literature, but is also very, very interesting and useful in how you see society at large, how you, like, more generally, not just in literature, but in all cultural studies. So once again, one thing that I want to remind you of, I keep repeating this and I will say this once again, when I mean text, when I use the word text, I refer not only to literary texts, that is, I don't just refer to short stories, novels, epics, etc., etc. We mean text in a much broader scope, right? We refer to television, we refer to advertisements. I also mean, graffiti, newspapers, etc. So when we say text, we use it in a very broad sense, right? So with that in mind, let's begin with Gramsci. Let's begin our discussion on Gramsci. So the first thing that I want you to know is that we're going to have a very objective oriented approach. We also had this approach when we were studying Tagore, but not very explicitly. But in the case of Gramsci, I think a more objective oriented study will be useful, because sometimes his language is a bit more complicated, and so there are some reasons. We'll discuss those reasons as we go along, right? So what are these objectives? What are we trying to achieve by studying Gramsci? Of course, there's the unwritten one, which is your syllabus. So apart from that, we will be trying to understand the historical and social context in which Gramsci was writing. This is very much the kind of title for this lecture, context, right? So yeah, we will look at the time in which Gramsci was writing, what triggered him to write, right? And where his, what the intellectual origins of his thought are, which is very much the third point here. So yeah, the second objective here would be to navigate through Gramsci's enigmatic language. So we need to talk about this a little bit, because if some of you have already tried to read the text, you may have found it quite difficult. Now the reason is that Gramsci had originally not written in English. He had written in Italian. Now this is one aspect of it, just one of the layers which add to the complications. The next layer would be the fact that he was in prison, and being in prison, he was subject to a great deal of censorship. Now we will talk about Gramsci's prison years a little more, but first let's focus on the language and why his language is enigmatic, right? So first layer is the fact that he wrote in Italian and the versions that we read are in English, so they are translated by some professor, some university somewhere, right? So that's number one. Number two, he was in prison for a very long time, and all of his writings, most of his writings that are accessible to us, that we read today, that have been translated into English, were written during his stay at prison. And since he was in prison, and he was a special kind of prisoner, right? He was not just a prisoner who had committed a theft, right? So this is very significant because he was, you may call him a political prisoner, right? Now, what are some examples of other political prisoners? You can think of Bhagat Singh, you can think of Nelson Mandela, you can also think about Mahatma Gandhi. So yeah, these are just some names off the top of my head, but then again, you may be aware of more names. So Gramsci was a similar kind of prisoner in his own country, Italy. Now, when is Gramsci writing? Right? See, all of these facts that I'm telling you will ultimately lead up to the fact that his writing is enigmatic. And I'm trying to explain what his stay in prison has to do with his writing. Particularly, what his stay in prison has to do with the difficulty that one experiences while reading Gramsci, right? So please note this very carefully. So Gramsci was a political activist. If you note the third point, you'll see that we are trying to trace the intellectual origins of Gramsci's ideas. Now, in terms of intellectual origins, Gramsci was greatly influenced by figures such as Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Lenin to a great extent. So there are obviously other thinkers, but these are some of the more obvious names, right? And so he was very much influenced by Marxist ideals and ideas of communism, and naturally he was an activist along those political lines. And at the same time, Europe at large, and particularly Italy, was experiencing, rise of nationalism. Now this is something you are also reading parallelly when you are studying Tagore, so you are already aware of nationalism and what it does and what it is capable of doing. So, and this nationalist movement was greatly led by, you have heard his name, Mussolini, right? So on the one hand you had Germany, which was being led by German nationalism led by Hitler and his men, and similarly in Italy you had Mussolini. And it's no wonder that these two people were, best of friends, BFFs. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is Gramsci was a political activist, and his political activism, his political activities did not go very well with Mussolini. And the result of which was Gramsci was thrown into prison. Now there's a very interesting story here. I'm not sure about the authenticity of the story, but this is more of a rumor. Like, people like to, when they refer to Gramsci, they often mention this story, and I think you must know this. Even my teacher, the person who taught me Gramsci, mentioned this in class. So I think you'd better know this. So Gramsci, like I said, was not a common thief. He was not in jail for stealing or robbery. He was in jail for, and yes, this is true, he was in jail for thinking, right? So because he was a very dangerous thinker, his thoughts, particularly when they were put in writing or when they were put in speeches, could do dangerous things. Dangerous to whom? Obviously to the political establishment. In this case, Mussolini, right? Or more generally speaking, his thoughts were destructive to nationalism, right? So antagonistic to nationalism and Mussolini. Now, it is said, and this is the story, that Mussolini is believed to have said that Gramsci must be stopped from thinking. We need to stop this man from thinking. If he thinks, he's going to ruin everything, right? So this is a kind of hype there is about Gramsci, and very much so, because if you read his works, and you'll see when he classifies the types of intellectuals, you'll see that what this man is doing is truly amazing, right? Because in his classification of intellectuals, he is showing us something which we probably wouldn't have noticed ourselves, right? So yeah, that's there. And so now going back to the entire prison thing, Gramsci, the political establishment at that time wanted Gramsci to be stopped from thinking. Now, for political reasons, for international pressure or whatever reason, they were not able to eliminate Gramsci altogether, so they put him in prison. I believe his political opponents would have loved to do that, but nevertheless, Gramsci was put into prison, and obviously prisoners do have some rights, irrespective of whether countries or the political establishments give those rights to the prisoners or not. Prisoners do have some rights, and the fact that Gramsci was able to write is an exercise of those rights. I hope you're able to follow. So Gramsci wrote, but his writings had to pass through the prison censorship, right? So in other words, whatever he wrote would be first read by someone at the prison, some authority, someone who was authorized to read his letters or whatever else he was writing, and only when they thought that this writing would not harm the political establishment were his writings allowed past the prison, right? So this is one of the facts surrounding Gramsci. So naturally, this man had to use enigmatic language, right? He had to invent words. It's called neologism. Neologism meaning create a new word. All right. So Gramsci created several new words, and I'm not sure you have heard of this, but there's a word called subaltern, and there's an entire discipline called subaltern studies, right? Subjects such as Dalit studies is under that discipline of subaltern studies. So this is a term which Gramsci gave us, right? Anyway, so there are many other terms that Gramsci came up with, and these terms didn't exist at the time, and he had to invent those terms to get past the prison censorship, right? So naturally, his language becomes more difficult than ordinary language, right? So two layers of complexity. First, it is translated, one, and two, due to his incarceration, he had to use a kind of language which would get him past censorship, and he was able to do that. So that's very much the point of the problem with Gramsci's enigmatic language, because when you probably open up the book or when you open up any of his essays, particularly the English translations, you may find them a bit difficult to navigate. But that's why we are discussing this point, and we will navigate the difficulty of Gramsci's language together. All right. So the third point, the third objective, I've already mentioned this slightly, but let's look at it once again. This objective is to trace the intellectual origins of Gramsci's thoughts and ideas. Now, I've already mentioned that he was heavily influenced by Marx, Engels, Lenin, and you will find that his ideas, somewhere or the others, stem from the ideas of Marx and the other thinkers I have mentioned. By all means, these are not the only thinkers he was influenced by. There are, probably dozens more, but these are the more obvious ones, right? Marx, very obviously, and you'll see traces of Marx everywhere in Gramsci's writing, and to a great degree, perhaps Lenin as well. So, like I mentioned, Gramsci was a political activist, and he was associated with the political ideology of communism, and that didn't gel very well with the ruling establishment at that time. Hence his incarceration. All right, point number 4, and this is very much pertaining to this text, this essay that you have in your syllabus, to understand the difference between traditional and organic intellectuals. Once again, these are, this is a distinction that Gramsci came up with. Now, it is possible to argue that thinkers before Gramsci have pointed out that there is a difference, there are different types of intellectuals, but Gramsci put it in a kind of language, in kind of words, which we are going to discuss. Right. So that's pertaining to the text specifically. So with these 4 objectives in mind, obviously there will be more objectives, and we will probably discover them as we read the text. But let's begin with these 4 objectives in mind. All right. So now let's look at the context of Gramsci's writing a little more specifically. So yeah, like I mentioned, that you will see a great deal of Marx, great deal of ideas, a good number of ideas of Gramsci stemming from the ideas of Marx. And let's just begin with one very well-known thought of Marx, which will probably be the base of our discussions in the coming lectures. So Marx, in his 11th thesis on Feuerbach, you do not have to remember this name, or you do not even have to remember this 11th thesis anything, right? He says, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways, The point, however, is to change it. These are also the words which are engraved on Karl Marx's tomb. But let's just focus on the words here, and we'll see how Gramsci takes this idea and what he does to this idea. So Marx says, very famous statement, like this is probably one of the few quotations of Marx that people who haven't read a single essay of Marx know, right? Philosophers until now have interpreted the world in various ways, but the point is to change it, right? So in very simple language, Marx simply means that intellectuals of his day and probably of our day as well are busy interpreting the human history or human story, whatever you like to call it. But the inequalities of society had made it impossible not to desire to change what they had learned. So again, going back to the statement, Marx says, philosophers until now have only tried to understand the world, but they haven't really tried to change it. But that is what we are going to do. That's what his attempt is, right? Now, this was a lesson that gripped the generations during Marx's generation, and also subsequent generations, continuing to our day, right? As intellectuals from different class backgrounds and different nationalities turn to their societies to learn about them and to transform them, right? So again, think of this distinction. Think of two groups of intellectuals, two groups of philosophers. First group only tries to understand what's happening in the world, right? First group only tries to answer why. If something is happening in society, their question is why and how. And group 2 is the group of philosophers or intellectuals who find out what has happened, what is happening, why it is happening, and they want to do something about it, right? So on the one hand, the first group is a very passive kind of intellectual, and the other kind is an active kind of intellectual, right? Someone who is actually involved. You may call this the emancipatory intellectual. This is not my term, this is used, and like you may choose to call this kind of intellectual, to which Gramsci belongs to, is the tradition of the emancipatory intellectual. I hope you are familiar with the word emancipation, liberty, freedom, right? Often used synonymously, interchangeably, meaning more or less the same thing, right? Emancipatory intellectual as opposed to passive intellectuals. Again, once more, passive intellectuals are those who just try to understand the world around them, but not really want to do anything about what they have understood. On the other hand, the emancipatory intellectual would not only want to understand the world, but having understood it, they would want to actually bring in some transformation, some change, right? Please keep that in mind. Now, why did I begin with Marx's quote? For the simple fact that Gramsci belonged to the tradition of intellectuals who wanted to make change and who actively worked to bring change, right? Naturally, he ended up in prison. All right. So at the time of Marx's comment, intellectuals wanted to understand the world, to draw explanations of what they saw around them. I've pretty much mentioned this already, but here goes. But most of them in Marx's time and in our own time wrote of the world without a sense of how to transform what they have observed. Theirs were texts of interpretation, texts that began with an attitude towards reality that suggested its intractable nature. It's a very important word here, intractable nature. In other words, a nature that cannot be changed. All right. Now, once again, I'm going back to the same distinction, now adding a little bit of nuance to it, right? Go back to the distinction of two kinds of intellectuals, passive intellectual and active or emancipatory intellectual. Passive intellectual is interested in understanding the world, in interpreting what the world is all about, right? But their writings, their ideas seem to suggest that nothing can be done about the world. Like, you can only understand the world, there is nothing that can be done. If the world is bad, this intellectual will be able to tell you why it is bad, but he will not be able to give you a solution, or he will not be able to work towards that solution, or simply may not want to work towards the solution. So this is what is referred to as intractable nature, a nature that simply cannot be changed. Now, this is the assumption of the passive intellectual, right? Intellectuals who are only interested in knowing what the world is about, who are only interested in understanding the social world or the physical world, and having understood it, they are done. Like, I have understood the world, now I can go to sleep. This is the attitude. Why can I go to sleep? Because there's nothing to be done, right? Nothing can be done. This is the idea of the first group of intellectuals. Again, coming to the second group, where we are putting Gramsci in, the emancipatory kind. They think that nature is not intractable. In other words, they think that if I have understood reality, if I have understood society, or like whatever, you can apply this to any discipline. If I have understood it, I can change it. So this is a fundamental line which can be drawn between the kinds of intellectuals, right? And this line is drawn by Marx, right? He makes a distinction between philosophers who tries to understand the world and a philosopher who tries to change it, right? I hope you have been able to follow. All right. Now coming to the next point, intellectuals and their social position. Now we are getting into pure Gramsci. So far what I have mentioned is the tradition to which Gramsci belonged, right? I hope you're able to follow, because so far I took a quote from Marx and tried to show you how that quotation is significant to our understanding of where an intellectual is located, on which side of the line an intellectual is located. Now we are getting into Gramsci and trying to see how Gramsci picks up those ideas 50 years later. By the time Gramsci was writing, by the time Gramsci was, writing in prison, incarcerated, Marx was long dead, right? So some 50 years after Marx had died, Gramsci, in a very different country, sitting in prison, trying to write and get past prison censorship in very enigmatic language, is taking up those ideas, and then he's working on those ideas. He's helping those ideas evolve, right? Ideas just don't sit dormant, right? Someone needs to pick them up and break those ideas down. That's what Gramsci is doing. So intellectuals, now we have come to Gramsci now, right? Whatever I have said till now, think of that as a context and use that context, keep that context in mind, and follow whatever is to be said next. All right. Intellectuals often see themselves as autonomous from institutions, governments, social hierarchies such as race, caste, class, and gender. Okay, what do I mean? Now, first of all, when I use the word intellectual, what image do you have? Now, since this is an one-way arrangement of taking a lecture, I can't get your answer, so I'll just make assumptions. I assume that when you hear the word intellectual, you're probably thinking of, professors and engineers, right? People, film directors, right? Artists. So these are the people we often think of as intellectuals, right? Now, all of these people, these intellectuals, often think of themselves as autonomous. In other words, the people whom you imagine as intellectuals, whether he's a professor or a film director or like whatever, right? An artist, painter, musician, whatever. So these people tend to think of themselves as independent. They think that, yeah, I'm an intellectual and I'm not influenced by anyone else, right? I'm autonomous, I'm independent. My social position or my gender, my class, caste, whatever, my race is not influencing my thoughts. I hope you have been able to follow so far. They often think that their ideas are objective, that they are not influenced by their social position in the world, right? But this is where Marx, Engels, Gramsci would disagree. They would say that such a posture, such detachment or objectivity is simply not possible. Now, what do these people have to say? Now, according to Gramsci and according to what Marx, Engels have suggested, intellectuals live in a world, they are rooted in this world, have their own class habits and their own class instincts. Therefore, their ideas are also influenced by their position in society. All right? I think that should be abundantly clear. So again, let's look at this distinction in terms of think of a line and think of two kinds of ideas on either side of the line. On one side, you would have intellectuals who are probably well educated, who are probably very influential in society, who are probably people who a lot of people would listen to, right? These people are under the impression, or they have made themselves believe that they are not being influenced by anyone, that they are not being influenced by governments, they are not being influenced by the institutions, right? They are not being influenced by social hierarchies such as race, caste, class, and gender. There are obviously other hierarchies, and I'm not going into those. But intellectuals like to believe that they are not influenced by any of these. But as Gramsci would tell you, this is not true. So what is Gramsci effectively telling us? He's saying that any intellectual, whoever that is, whether it's a professor, whether it's a film director, whether it's a musician, anything, all of these intellectuals are influenced by their position in society, right? So again, think of just giving a typical example of an intellectual who say is a film director, right? Let's assume, think of a film director who belongs to, who is really well bred, right? Who comes from a very rich family, right? If such a person comes and he or she believes that he is not influenced by his position in society, that the ideas he has are not in any way rooted in his position in society, he is absolutely wrong. This is what Gramsci is saying. So in other words, in the bottom line of what I have said in the last 2-3 minutes is that it is simply not possible for an intellectual to not be influenced by his or her position in society, right? So again, to break this down further, any person, any intellectual, his or her position in society, that is, in other words, his race, his or her caste, class, gender, all of these contribute to his intellectualizing or intellectualization, right? Just think of, again, random example, take two film directors from two different social backgrounds, right? Take someone who is very well off, who was born with a silver spoon or golden spoon with his mouth, and think of another director who rose from a very humble background, and then imagine both these directors have reached the same amount of international fame and recognition. But do you think their worldview will be the same? Both of them may like to believe that they are not influenced by their surroundings at all. But this is where Gramsci comes in and tells us that is simply not possible, right? And that shows in the work, in the writings, in the films they make, in everything that they do. All right. Moving on, Gramsci, like I mentioned, almost 50 years after the death of Marx, took up the theme of the emancipatory intellectual. I've already explained this. Emancipatory intellectual as opposed to the passive intellectual. Please go back to what I have said earlier if you need to refer to it. So he takes up the theme of the emancipatory intellectual, someone who did not just want to understand the world, but wanted to change it. He saw that there was not one kind but many kinds of intellectuals. So this is where Gramsci is actually contributing. So you have to keep in mind that Gramsci is not just writing, he's not blabbering, right? He's writing, he's actually contributing something to intellectual thought, right? He is one of the early thinkers who is able to see that there are multiple kinds of intellectuals. Now, most intellectuals were either averse to any change, like I said, this is the passive kind, or did not see themselves as emancipatory, right? So intellectuals of the passive kind, either they thought that nature was intractable, nothing could be done about it, or even if they thought something could be done about it, they were simply not interested in doing anything about it. These people saw themselves as technical thinkers, right? Now, what do I mean by technical thinkers? Let me break this down a little bit for you. A technical thinker is someone who likes to believe that he is detached. You give him a problem, he will give you a solution without being involved anywhere. So that way he's a technical thinker, right? Now there's this Greek/Latin word called techne, from where we get the words technique, technology, etc. Now, what is techne? Techne has to do with basically technique, or techne is something which is used to solve a problem or to understand the problem, right? So in this case, more emphasis on understanding the problem. So these intellectuals, the first kind, the passive kind, saw themselves as merely technical thinkers and not emancipatory ones. Please remember this distinction. Now here, Gramsci offers a very useful distinction between organic intellectuals, traditional intellectuals, and intellectuals of a third kind, right? This is something he comes up on his own. All right, so think of this as the context, and also think of this as an introduction to Gramscian thought. In the next class, we will again focus a little more on the text, and we'll actually try to understand the differences between organic intellectuals and traditional intellectuals, and by understanding the difference, we'll also try to understand what this third kind of intellectual is that Gramsci talks about, right? So here we'll stop and we'll pick up in the next lecture.